My name is Alan, and if you spent any time listening to the stories on this channel, you know that the most terrifying things don't always happen in the dark corners of a haunted house. Sometimes they happen out in the open, in the spaces where human civilization ends and the vast, uncaring wilderness begins. For me, that place was a small, regional airfield tucked away in the dense, old-growth timberlands of northern Maine, right on the jagged edge of the Canadian border. Back in the late 90s, I was working the graveyard shift as a night air traffic controller. Oakhaven Field wasn't the kind of place that handled commercial airliners or bustling holiday crowds. Most nights, our logs were completely blank. We dealt with twin-prop cargo charters, wealthy locals moving their private Cessnas, or the occasional pilot who got turned around over the Atlantic when the coastal weather decided to turn ugly. It was a lonely job, but to be completely honest with you, that's exactly why I took it. I've always been a bit of a solitary guy. There was something deeply peaceful about sitting in that concrete control cab, high above the world, with nothing but the rhythmic green sweep of the radar scope, the low hum of the vacuum tube hardware, and a piping hot thermos of black coffee to keep me company. The tower itself was a brutalist concrete cylinder built back in the late 1960s. It felt less like a modern facility and more like an old military outpost. When you looked out through the massive, slanted glass windows at night, you couldn't see a single light for 30 miles. It was just a pitch-black sea of pine trees stretching into eternity. On a normal night, it was a sanctuary. But as anyone who has ever worked the hours between midnight and dawn will tell you, prolonged isolation does strange things to the human mind. You start to hear whispers in the radio static. You start to see phantom shapes in the green glare of the radar screen. You learn to shrug it off. You tell yourself it's just fatigue, just your brain filling in the empty spaces. But what happened to me during my final week at Oakhaven wasn't a trick of the mind. I know that now, because the paper trail they tried to burn left a scar that time simply hasn't been able to erase. It was a miserable Thursday night in mid-November. A massive, freezing rainstorm had rolled in from the coast, burying the entire valley in a heavy, suffocating mountain fog. The kind of fog that doesn't just block your vision, but actively dampens sound, wrapping the airfield in a thick, eerie silence. Ground visibility was essentially zero. My supervisor, an old-timer named Greg, who was practically counting down the days until his retirement pension kicked in, had headed down to the basement break room around 2 a.m. to catch a quick nap. He told me to wake him if the automated weather station reported any significant wind shears, and then he left me alone in the dark cab. For the first 15 minutes, it was completely dead. I was sitting back in my worn leather chair, lazily turning the pages of an aviation magazine, when my headset suddenly crackled to life. Now, I need you to understand something about the audio. It wasn't the clean, sharp digital squelch of our modern transceiver systems. It was a heavy, dense, analog hiss, the distinct, warm crackle of legacy vacuum tube equipment that hadn't been standard since the Vietnam War era. Through the static, a voice came through. It was faint, buried under layers of white noise, but it was unmistakably a man. What struck me immediately wasn't what he said, but how he said it. His voice possessed a strange, stiff, mid-Atlantic formality. He sounded incredibly calm, almost unnaturally so, given the weather conditions outside. Oakhaven Tower, this is Flight November Alpha 480, do you copy? I pulled the boom mic closer to my lips, shaking off the sleepiness. November Alpha 480, this is Oakhaven Tower. We read you faint but clear. State your position and intentions. There was a long, agonizing pause. The static on the frequency seemed to rise and fall, mimicking the sound of waves crashing against a distant cliff. Then, the voice cut through the hiss again. Oakhaven, we are establishing an inbound vector for runway 09, requesting local weather update and altimeter settings. Our fuel state is critical. We've been in the soup for a very long time. I instinctively leaned forward, my eyes darting to my primary radar scope. The glowing green line swept around the glass circle, painting the empty airspace over our sector. Nothing. The screen was completely bare. There wasn't a single blip, a single pixel of light within a 50-mile radius. I checked our secondary transponder matrix, the digital system that reads commercial flight codes. It was entirely blank. I frowned, a slight knot forming in my stomach. Flight 480, Oakhaven. I am currently not painting you on my primary or secondary scopes. Please squawk Iden and confirm your current altitude and heading. The pilot responded instantly, without a hint of hesitation. Altitude 9,000 feet, heading 085. We do not carry a modern transponder system. Oakhaven. Our equipment is legacy. We are a Lockheed L-188 Electra, requesting visual guidance. The clouds are exceptionally thick. It feels like they're pressing against a glass. A Lockheed Electra. My mind did a quick mental calculation. That was a 4-engine turboprop airliner popular in the late 1950s and 60s. Nobody flew them anymore. Certainly not for commercial runs, unless it was a highly specialized cargo charter or a wealthy collector flying a meticulously restored vintage bird. Doing so in a zero-visibility coastal fog was borderline suicidal, but people do stupid things with airplanes every single day. I figured he was a hobbyist who had lost his instruments. Roger, Flight 480. I said, trying to keep my tone professional and steady. Maintain your current altitude. I'm going to try to pick you up on our overall radar deck. Hold your heading. We kept an ancient analog radar deck at the back of the cab, a massive olive drab unit from the late 60s that we affectionately called a green monster. It was old, clunky, but it bypassed all the modern digital filtering, relying purely on raw radio echoes bouncing off bare metal. I stepped over to the machine, flipped the heavy toggle switches, and cranked the manual gain sensitivity all the way up. I watched the circular screen sweep through the dark. The line hit the northern quadrant, directly over the deepest, most inaccessible part of the state forest, and my breath caught in my throat. A massive, solid white return bloomed instantly on the glass. It wasn't small, flickering out like a typical aircraft. It was a dense, jagged tear of light, sitting perfectly stationary right in the center of Sector 4. The raw radar was registering a massive metallic object hanging in the sky at 9,000 feet, completely motionless against a 20-knot headwind. And that was the exact moment the digital clock on the tower wall began to glitch. I watched the red LED numbers flicker violently. The time was exactly 2:14 a.m. Then, with a soft, distinct electronic beat that echoed in the quiet cab, the digits rolled backward. 2:13, 2:12. 2:11, my jaw dropped. The clock steadily unraveled, ticking down in reverse before finally freezing hard at 2:08 a.m. I looked down at my analog wristwatch. The hands were still ticking forward. It read 2:14. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. I reached out to grab the landline receiver to call down to the break room and wake Greg. But before my fingers could even wrap around the plastic, the radio frequency exploded into life. The calm, rigid formality of the pilot was completely gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror that made my blood run cold. Oakhaven, do you copy? The instruments are rolling back, he screamed. The background audio on his end had shifted dramatically. The deep mechanical thunder of the 4 turboprop engines was screaming at maximum RPM, straining against the air. But underneath the roar of the engines, there was another sound, a high-pitched, rhythmic, mechanical wailing. It sounded exactly like an old air raid siren, rising and falling in a terrifying, agonizing cadence. We've lost the horizon. The trees. Dear God, the trees are above us. Oakhaven, adjust our vector. Adjust our vector. Flight 480, descend to 6,000 feet immediately. Turn right, heading 100. I yelled into my headset, completely forgetting about the clock, forgetting about the protocol, driven purely by the primal instinct to save a dying crew. Do you copy, Flight 480? You are over the ridgeline. Turn right immediately. We can't. A second voice screamed over the radio, the co-pilot, his voice cracked and distorted by absolute panic. The clock is at 0. The party is over. The party is... The transmission suddenly devolved into a horrific, deafening screech of tearing metal and shattering glass. But the line didn't go dead. The sound of the crashing aircraft quickly faded away, leaving nothing but the agonizingly loud air raid siren blaring through the static. It was so piercing, so incredibly loud that I ripped the foam headset off my ears and slammed it down onto the console desk. Even lying bare on the metal surface, the speakers inside the headset were screaming the siren sound into the empty, darkened tower cab. I stood there, hyperventilating, my hands hovering over the master radio console, desperately trying to find the switch to kill the frequency. But as I looked up, staring out to the heavy glass windows into the gray, impenetrable fog, my entire body froze solid. Far out in the distance, miles into the heart of protected state forest, where there were no roads, no power lines, and no human structures for a generation, a massive, pale green light was pulsating through the heavy clouds. It expanded and contracted over the tree line, blooming through the fog in a perfect, rhythmic synchronization with the rising and falling wail of the siren coming from my headset. Suddenly, the heavy metal security door to the tower cab swung open with a loud click. Greg walked back in, carrying a fresh, steaming mug of coffee. The very instant his boot crossed the threshold into the room, the red digits on the wall clock blinked once, and instantly snapped back to 2:16 a.m. The headset on the desk went dead silent. Out in the distance, the green light vanished, leaving nothing behind but the empty, rainy blackness of the Maine woods. Greg looked at me, taking in my pale face, my wide eyes, and the discarded headset on the console. He set his coffee down, his brow furrowing. "You all right, Alan? Jesus, you look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard, trying to force my voice through a throat that felt like dry sand. "Greg, tell me you heard that on the emergency frequency. Flight 480. The crash, the siren." Greg stared at me, completely confused. "Flight 480? No, I didn't hear a thing down in the lounge, Alan. The master audio board downstairs mirrors the tower cab perfectly. The frequency has been quiet as a grave all night." "Why? What did you think you heard?" Without giving him an answer, I pushed past him and stepped over to the master digital recording terminal. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely hit the keys on the keyboard to bring up the automated audio logs for the last 10 minutes of our shift. I found the file stamped for 2:14 a.m., clicked it, and turned the monitor volume up to maximum. Nothing. There was no pilot. There was no screaming co-pilot. There was no roaring of engines and no mechanical air raid siren. There was only 3 minutes of low, perfectly uniform, empty static. Greg gave me a sympathetic, yet deeply concerned look, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Look, Alan, the night shift does things to a man. The fog, the isolation, the endless staring at screens. Sometimes your brain just fills in the empty space with whatever it can find. Why don't you head down to the break room for 20 minutes? Let me cover the deck." I didn't argue with him. I took off my badge, walked down the stairs, and sat on the old vinyl couch in the break room. But I didn't sleep. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the linoleum floor, my mind racing in circles. I knew what I had heard. I knew the vivid, undeniable difference between a tired mind playing tricks and the sound of a man screaming out his final words into a radio. The next morning, the moment my shift ended at 6 a.m., I didn't drive back to my apartment. The encounter had dug its claws deep into my psyche, and I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I looked into it myself. I drove straight to the downtown public library, waited in my car until the doors opened at 9, and spent the next 4 hours buried in the back room, digging through the dusty microfiche archives of the regional newspaper. I searched for every aviation accident, every missing aircraft report in the history of northern Maine. It took me until noon, my eyes bloodshot from staring at the glowing projection screen, but I finally found it. It was a front-page article from October 1974. A chartered Lockheed L-188 Electra, carrying a group of corporate executives, with a registration tail number N480NA, had completely vanished off the radar while en route from Montreal to Bangor. The last confirmed radar contact before the signal dropped entirely was right over the Oakhaven sector. Because of a sudden historic autumn blizzard in the dense, nearly vertical terrain of the northern wilderness, the wreckage was never located. The plane, the crew, and the passengers had simply dissolved into the endless pines. But it was the very last paragraph of the article that made the hairs on my arms stand straight up. According to the official FAA investigation log cited by the reporter, the final, Heavily garbled radio transmission from the pilot before the plane went missing was a frantic complaint that their cockpit instruments were rolling backward in time, accompanied by a loud, unexplainable background static that sounded exactly like a mechanical air raid siren. I walked out of that library in a daze. I went back to the station, handed in my formal resignation to a shocked Greg, and packed my locker within 3 days. My wife thought I was completely losing my mind. I had a rock-solid career path, great state benefits, and a clear trajectory into high-level radar management. But I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't bear the thought of sitting in that concrete cylinder in the dead of night, staring out into the pitch-black ocean of trees, waiting for that vacuum tube static to bleed to the modern lines again. I took a low-paying, quiet desk job at a shipping logistics firm in Portland, far away from the radar scopes, far away from the empty skies. I thought that by moving away, I could leave the mystery behind in the woods of Sector 4. But 3 years later, while sitting in my quiet suburban home, I stumbled across a bizarre independent videotape that proved my encounter wasn't an isolated event. It was just one small cog in a massive, terrifying machine. My name is David. If Alan's story proved anything, it's that when the higher-ups want something to disappear, they don't just bury it in the dirt. They scrub it from the airwaves. By the late 90s, I was trying to build a career in media, working the late shift as a video editor and master control operator for a tiny public access TV station in Western Maryland. The station was squeezed into the damp basement of an old community center that smelled like industrial floor wax and stale coffee. We didn't have any of the modern digital editing suites you see today. We were completely analog, surrounded by wall-to-wall racks of heavy 3/4-inch U-matic tapes, VHS decks, and massive linear editing boards that took an eternity to queue up. It was a boring, mind-numbing gig, but I didn't mind the isolation. While the rest of the city was asleep, I'd sit under those flickering fluorescent lights, drinking cheap gas station coffee, transferring town council meetings to tape, and keeping the automated community calendar running. It was peaceful routine, until a stormy Tuesday night in November changed everything. The rain was coming down in sheets, rattling against the street-level windows at the top of the basement wall. The station manager and the daytime crew had gone home hours ago, leaving me completely alone. Around 1:30 a.m., a sudden, violent knock rattled the frosted glass of our back alley entrance, a secure door meant strictly for equipment deliveries. Frowning, I got up and unlocked it. Standing in the downpour was a young man, completely drenched, gasping for air as if he'd been running for miles. His eyes held a frantic, animalistic panic. Without saying a single word, he thrust a heavy black VHS tape without a label into my hands, turned on his heel, and sprinted back into the dark, rainy alley. I stood there in the doorway, completely stunned, holding the wet plastic casing. My first thought was that it was a local college kid trying to pull a prank or drop off a weird student film. But the sheer terror in that guy's eyes made my curiosity get the better of me. I took the tape back to the edit bay, dried it off with a paper towel, and slid it into our master VTR deck. I hit play. The monitor flickered violently, choking on a heavy wall of gray tracking lines, before settling into a shaky handheld camera feed. The recording belonged to a local independent journalist named Marcus. I recognized him immediately because he'd occasionally submit short packages on local history. But this footage wasn't for the evening news. Marcus was creeping through the abandoned brick-lined drainage tunnels that ran directly beneath our city's downtown district. The audio was low and echoing, filled with the steady drip of subterranean water and his own ragged breathing. Whispering frantically into the microphone, Marcus explained that he was investigating the sudden, unexplained disappearance of dozens of local Tunawisma, the city's homeless population, who routinely used the tunnels for shelter during the harsh winter months. The local police had completely dismissed the missing persons reports, publicly claiming the transients had simply moved south for the winter. But Marcus had uncovered something deeply sinister. As the camera panned down a dark, concrete junction, the flashlight beam caught a series of bizarre, deliberate markings scratched into the brickwork. They were perfect circles, about 2 inches wide, etched deeply into the stone. Weirder still, thick, Healthy tree branches had been dragged into the subterranean tunnels and planted completely upright in the mud, forming a bizarre, artificial grove beneath the city streets. Suddenly, a sound bled through the tape's audio track. It was a low, rhythmic mechanical wailing. My stomach dropped instantly. It was the exact same sound Alan had heard in the skies over Maine, a terrifying mechanical air raid siren, rising and falling in a rhythmic cadence. "They aren't moving south," Marcus whispered, the camera shaking so violently the image blurred. "Something is drawing them down here. A localized frequency, an artificial chemical fog." I saw men in unmarked dark suits setting up massive generators near the eastern vault. The city isn't ignoring this. They're orchestrating it. They're testing a localized environmental parameter, forcing people into the... Without warning, the audio track distorted into a horrific, blown-out screech of static. But the tape didn't cut to black. The visual feed suddenly became unnaturally, flawlessly crystal clear. Marcus stopped running. He slowly turned the camera toward his own face. He looked entirely pale, his eyes completely hollow and devoid of emotion. My blood turned to pure ice. Marcus was looking directly into the camera lens, but it didn't feel like a recorded playback anymore. It felt like he was staring directly through the glass of my CRT monitor, looking straight into my eyes. And out of the pitch-black tunnel behind him, a tall, broad-shouldered figure materialized. It stood painfully straight, like a pitch-black mannequin, surrounded by thin, dancing wafts of green, pulsating smoke. Marcus opened his mouth to let out a scream, but before any sound could escape, the monitor erupted into a blinding wall of pure snow. I fell back in my rolling chair, gasping for air, the hair on my arm standing completely on end. The atmosphere in that basement edit bay felt physically heavy, suffocating. Realizing I was holding a tape containing evidence of a massive, lethal conspiracy, I lunged forward to dub a copy onto our master archive deck. But the moment my hand hovered over the control board, the digital clock on the wall glitched. The red LED numbers began rolling backward at an impossible speed. 1:45, 1:30, 1:15. It stopped dead at 1:08 a.m. The power in the entire basement dipped, the fluorescent tubes humming with a deep, sickening vibration before casting a pale green hue across the room. The massive linear editing decks next to me began to queue up on their own, the heavy tape reels spinning violently forward and backward with a terrifying mechanical clatter. Suddenly, the heavy metal security door to the master control room let out a loud click. I watched the deadbolt slide open entirely on its own. Panic seized my chest. I ripped the unlabeled VHS tape out of the deck, shoved it inside my heavy winter jacket, and backed into the furthest corner of the room, clutching a heavy metal maglite flashlight. I stared at the open doorway, fully expecting the shadow figure from the drainage tunnels to step into the light. Instead, the lights flickered sharply, snapping back to their normal white glow. The digital clock blinked and instantly jumped forward to 2 a.m. The room went completely, hauntingly silent, shaking and covered in cold sweat. I immediately slid the tape back into the VTR to see if the footage was still there. I hit play. The tape spun smoothly, but the monitor showed nothing but a solid, silent block of empty gray static. The entire recording had been completely wiped clean, demagnetized from a distance by whatever electromagnetic pulse had just surged through the station's grid. I didn't sleep a single wink the rest of that night. I just sat on the floor, staring at the open door until dawn. The next afternoon, the nightmare took a permanent, bureaucratic turn. I walked into the station for my regular shift, only to find two plainclothes men in dark suits standing inside the manager's office. My manager, usually a loud and boisterous guy, looked utterly defeated, his hands trembling as he handed over our master broadcast logs. One of the suits stepped out into the hallway, his cold, unblinking eyes locking onto me. He casually tossed a morning newspaper onto the editing desk. The front page headline detailed a tragic house fire that had occurred downtown at approximately 2 a.m. The victim was a local independent journalist named Marcus. The official police statement claimed he had suffered a sudden, fatal cardiac arrest inside his home before the fire broke out, ruling the entire incident an accidental electrical malfunction. The suit leaned in close, the smell of expensive cologne doing nothing to mask the clinical, predatory vibe radiating off him. "David," he said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet undertone, "we understand a disgruntled transit threw a stolen archive tape into your alleyway entrance last night. We've already collected the station security footage for verification. Your manager confirms that no official edits or recordings took place during your shift. The isolation of the graveyard hours can cause a young man to experience vivid auditory hallucinations. It's best for your career and your family's safety if we all agree it was a completely quiet night. They had scrubbed everything. They knew I had the tape, and they knew it was already useless because they had erased it remotely using the station's own high-voltage transmitter tower. I handed in my resignation the very next day. I packed up my car, left Maryland entirely, and took a low-profile archiving job for a corporate logistics firm in Ohio, far away from public broadcasting and local mysteries. Decades have passed since that night, and the official archive still lists Marcus's death as a closed, accidental tragedy. But I know what I saw on that linear deck before time rolled backward. I know that somewhere beneath the streets, those brick tunnels are still humming with a frequency that doesn't belong to this world. They were gathering human test subjects for something massive. And it wasn't until I read a letter from a former wilderness camp counselor in Oregon years later that I finally understood where those missing people were being taken and what the green light was preparing them for. My name is Marcus. If Alan's experience at the air traffic tower was the first accidental breach, and David's night at the TV station was a corporate cleanup, then what happened to me in the winter of 1997 was a horrifying destination where all those loose threads finally tied together. That December, I was working as a seasonal counselor for a private youth organization called the Alpine Horizons Foundation. They operated a sprawling, rustic retreat camp nestled deep within a jagged valley in the Cascade Mountains of Oregon. It was an incredibly isolated property, completely cut off from the outside world by miles of dense, old-growth timberlands. During the summer, the camp was a thriving hub for wealthy kids kayaking and hiking. But in the winter, the foundation ran specialized leadership camps for troubled, high-risk teenagers. The official brochure claimed that the harsh winter environment, rigid structure, and intense group bonding would help straighten these kids out. I took the job because I was desperate. I had just dropped out of my university semester, went through a brutal breakup, and needed a place to disappear where I didn't have to think about my future. The foundation provided free room and board in the staff quarters, and for a guy in his early 20s with a completely shredded psyche, it felt like the perfect escape. The camp director was a severe, tight-lipped older man named Vance. He ran the outpost like a military compound, demanding absolute discipline from the counselors and maintaining a strict, impenetrable wall between the ground staff and the high-level executive committee that funded the foundation. That particular winter was exceptionally brutal. By the second week of December, a massive, historic low-pressure system stalled directly over our valley. It dumped 4 feet of dry snow within 48 hours and brought in a thick, suffocating mountain fog that never seemed to lift. It wasn't a normal weather front. It was heavy, damp, and held a strange metallic weight to it that deadened every single sound in the camp. You could yell at the top of your lungs 20 yards away, and the fog would just swallow the noise whole. There were 14 teenagers bunked in the main timber-frame dormitory that week. On Tuesday evening, the camp's old yellow transport bus, our absolute lifeline to the main highway 30 miles away, suddenly broke down. The camp mechanic, a quiet local guy named Arlo, claimed the engine block had mysteriously cracked right down the middle from the cold. When I asked Vance when the replacement parts or a backup transport would arrive, he brushed me off with a cold glare, stating that the storm had brought down the regional phone lines and we simply had to wait it out. But things didn't add up. I knew for a fact the camp had a high-powered backup generator and a sophisticated satellite radio system inside the main administrative lodge. The problem was Vance kept the building strictly padlocked, and no one was allowed near it after dark. By Thursday night, the isolation was beginning to take a severe psychological toll on the kids. Confined to the freezing dormitory, they did nothing but stare out the frost-covered windows into the endless gray void. To make matters worse, The central heating system in the building began to fail, leaving the air inside dangerously cold in certain spots, despite the massive stone fireplace roaring at the end of the hall. I was doing my midnight rounds in the upper corridor when the first real wave of absolute unease hit me. It started with a scent. It wasn't the comforting smell of burning pine logs on the hearth. It was an artificial, deeply chemical odor, sharp, acrid, and smelling distinctly of industrial plastics and heavy fuel additives. It was the exact same smell David's journalist friend had described in the drainage tunnels of Maryland. As I walked past a row of boys' bunks, I noticed two of the older kids, Tyler and Ben, sitting completely upright in their sleeping bags, their faces pale and fixated on the window. "Marcus, look," Tyler whispered, his voice trembling so hard his teeth clicked. He pointed a shaking finger through the glass. I leaned over and peered out into the dense, swirling fog. At first, there was only gray darkness. But then, about 50 yards away near the frozen tree line of the lake, the fog began to shift in an impossible way. A pale, green pulsating light bloomed behind the pines. It didn't look like a flashlight, a flare, or a vehicle beam. It expanded and contracted in a perfectly rhythmic mechanical cadence. And as I stared into the glow, the hairs on the back of my neck stood dead straight, moving effortlessly through the 4 feet of snow with the distinct, translucent outlines of tall, humanoid forms. They didn't leave a single track in the drifts. Their bodies looked completely warped, like looking through a sheet of heavy, distorted glass or a digital cloaking effect. They were the exact same mannequin-like silhouettes Alan had seen from the air traffic tower. "Go back to sleep, guys." I lied, my voice cracking under the tension. "It's just a thermal inversion reflecting the security lights off the low clouds. Nothing to worry about." They didn't believe me, but they pulled their blankets over their heads. My heart was hammering violently against my ribs. Realizing that the safety of the kids was compromised, I marched out into the freezing night, sprinting through the deep snow toward the administrative lodge to confront Vance. I didn't care about breaking protocol anymore. As I approached the dark timber building, I noticed the heavy padlocks on the front door were missing. The door was slightly ajar, swinging quietly in the mountain wind. I slipped inside, the floorboards groaning softly beneath my boots. The main office was dark, but a faint, sharp light emanated from the secure document room in the back. I crept forward and peered around the wooden doorframe. Vance was standing over a filing cabinet, sorting through thick folders by the light of a small desk lamp. Beside him on the desk sat a heavy, military-grade radio terminal. It was fully powered, its green digital display glowing brightly. The phone lines weren't down at all. Vance was actively listening to a live transmission, his face completely grim and hollow. Through the heavy static of the speaker, a cold, clinical, bureaucratic voice was speaking. "Sector 4 containment parameters are holding. The chemical fog generators are operating at maximum capacity. Psychological stress indicators in the test subjects are nearing the target threshold. Maintain absolute isolation until the retrieval team arrives on Sunday." Vance sighed, pressing the mic button. "Understood. The ground counselors are becoming highly restless, but I am managing the perimeter. The entities are closing in on the dormitory building now. Ensure the final payment to the Foundation's offshore account is cleared by morning." I stood there in the dark hallway, completely paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying gravity of what I was witnessing. Alpine Horizons wasn't a youth leadership camp. It was a controlled human testing ground funded by an elite corporate syndicate, and the troubled teenagers, along with the disposable counselors, were nothing but lab rats in a cage. The cracked engine block on the bus had been sabotaged on purpose to cut off our only escape route. They were using the missing transients David had tracked. And now, they were using us to test the operational limits of these otherworldly entities. Before my brain could even process the horror, a massive, deafening explosion echoed from the direction of the dormitory. I backed away from the office door, turned on my heel, and sprinted out into the freezing night. The master air raid siren on top of the dining hall suddenly burst into life, its loud mechanical shriek rising and falling to the heavy fog in that exact same terrifying cadence Alan had heard over his headset. Through the mechanical din, the screams of the trapped teenagers pierced the air. When I reached the dormitory, the scene was pure, unadulterated chaos. Thick, acrid chemical smoke was pouring out of the ground floor vents. I lunged toward the main entrance doors, only to find they had been heavily chained and padlocked from the outside while I was running from a lodge. The kids were trapped on the upper floor, coughing violently, blind with panic as the toxic smoke rose rapidly through the floorboards. Open the windows. I screamed at the top of my lungs, desperately striking the heavy padlocks with an iron fire poker I snatched from the porch deck. Jump to the snow drifts. You have to jump right now. The drop from the second-floor windows was nearly 15 feet down onto shallow snow and hard concrete. The older kids began frantically throwing open the casements, leaping out blindly into the dark gray void. I watched in absolute horror as several teenagers hit the hard ground with sickening thuds, crying out in agony as their bones snapped or their ankles sprained. Panic took over completely. The kids were literally climbing over one another, shoving the smaller 6- and 7-year-olds out of the way to escape the suffocating black air. Just as the smoke became completely fatal and the wood began to give way, the loud roar of a heavy diesel engine cut through the screaming. It was Arlo, the groundskeeper. He had somehow bypassed the sabotage on the old camp bus, roaring around the corner of the snowbank and slamming the vehicle lengthwise directly underneath the burning dormitory windows. Jump onto the roof. Arlo yelled through the open driver's window, his face pale as death. Get them out, Marcus. The kids began tumbling out of the upper windows, landing heavily on the metal roof of the bus, which flexed and dented violently under their weight. Arlo and I worked like madmen, hauling the injured, coughing teenagers down from the roof and shoving them inside the bus cabin. I scrambled up the ladder and pulled the final remaining girl out of a smoke-filled window just as the entire wooden structure of the dormitory erupted into a massive chemical-fueled firestorm. We threw the last kid into the back seats, and Arlo slammed the bus into reverse, tearing down the treacherous, icy mountain road just as the rear tires began to catch fire from the radiant heat of the burning compound. By dawn, the bus had smashed through the locked outer gates of the valley and made it to a state trooper precinct on the main highway. The injured kids were rushed to regional hospitals, and within 2 hours, the entire camp sector was locked down by an overwhelming force of state police and unidentified federal officials in dark, unmarked vehicles. But that is where the story takes its darkest, most permanent turn, the part that has turned the last 30 years of my life into a slow, waking nightmare. While I was sitting in a sterile, windowless interrogation room at the state trooper precinct, coughing up the last remnants of that acrid chemical smoke, I genuinely believed the nightmare was over. I thought Arlo and I were heroes. I thought that once the state police saw the chained doors, the charred ruins of the dormitory, and the terrifying data on Vance's satellite radio terminal, the people responsible for this corporate horror show would be hunted down and thrown into a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. But I was young, and I still didn't understand how the world truly worked. I didn't understand that when conspiracy goes as deep, the truth isn't just suppressed, it's entirely rewritten. About 2 hours into my wait, the local state troopers were abruptly dismissed from the building. The door opened, and 2 plainclothes men in dark, unmarked suits walked in. They didn't ask me about the fire. They didn't ask about the injured kids, or the terrifying green lights pulsating in the fog, or the translucent, mannequin-like entities that left no tracks in the snow. Instead, one of them calmly tossed a morning edition of the regional newspaper onto the metal table in front of me. I stared at the front-page headline, and the blood completely drained from my face. The article boldly claimed that a tragic, accidental fire had broken out at Camp Alpine due to a faulty space heater in the lower utility room. It went on to state that a crazed, disgruntled local hermit living in the surrounding wilderness had been apprehended by authorities while fleeing the valley with stolen gasoline cans from a camp depot. The paper stated the hermit had confessed to the arson in a closed door, in media arraignment, and was facing permanent institutionalization in a maximum security psychiatric facility. I looked up at the suits, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and absolute disbelief. This is complete lie. I saw the locks on the outside of the doors. I heard the radio transmission in the lodge. Vance locked those kids, and on purpose. They were running an experiment. There were things out in that fog. The older suit leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the table. His eyes were entirely dead, completely devoid of human warmth. "Son," he said, his voice dropping to a clinical, terrifyingly calm undertone. "You had a very traumatic night. Prolonged isolation, extreme cold, and severe smoke inhalation can cause a young mind to experience vivid, paranoid hallucinations. If you want to keep your freedom, and if you want to ensure that your family back home stays perfectly safe, you will sign this non-disclosure agreement, take the severance check from the foundation, and forget you ever stepped foot in the Cascade Mountains. As far as the public, the courts, and the law are concerned, the case is closed." They had mapped out the cover-up before the ashes of the dormitory had even finished smoldering. Vance vanished in the thin air that very morning, leaving no paper trail. The Alpine Horizons Foundation officially dissolved its legal entity within a week, shifting its assets into another faceless offshore shell company. Arlo, the brave groundskeeper who had saved dozens of lives with that yellow transport bus, was quietly paid off and moved out of state a month later. He never left a forwarding address. I tried to find him years later, but it was as if the man had been completely erased from the grid. I signed the paperwork. I had no choice. I was a broke, 20-something dropout with the weight of shadow government pressing down on my chest. I took my mother's advice. She was a tough, no-nonsense woman who had survived her own share of political horrors, and I moved as far away from the Pacific Northwest as I could get. I took a low-profile job doing digital database management in Ohio, buried my head in routine work, and spent the next 2 decades trying to pretend that the wail of that air raid siren wasn't constantly echoing in the back of my mind. But the truth has a strange way of running a marathon. It doesn't matter how fast the lies sprint or how much concrete they pour over the evidence. The universe eventually forces the pieces back together. In the winter of 2022, long after I had hidden my past from the world, I crossed paths with David through an anonymous online forum dedicated to tracking unexplainable electromagnetic anomalies. David had posted a heavily redacted transcript of the videotape he had witnessed during his graveyard shift at that public access TV station in Maryland. As I read his words, my hand began to shake so violently I dropped my coffee mug onto the floor. The circle markings scratched into the concrete, the healthy tree branches planted upright in the dark drainage tunnels, the missing transients who had vanished without a trace, and the final, terrifying visual of a journalist named Marcus staring helplessly through a crystal-clear lens while a tall, broad-shouldered mannequin of shadow and green smoke materialized out of the dark. It was the exact same parameter. The syndicate wasn't just testing the entities in the isolated valleys of Oregon. They were harvesting marginalized human beings from the underbelly of American cities, utilizing localized chemical fog frequencies to alter environmental boundaries and bridge the gap between our world and something truly monstrous. And when I finally reached out to Alan, who had fled his air traffic control tower in Maine after tracking a stationary, massive radar return that rolled the digital clocks backward in time, the grand, horrifying picture was finally complete. Alan's tower had accidentally intercepted the raw, unfiltered frequency of the very first phase of the experiment back in the 70s. David had witnessed the corporate harvesting of the subsurface subjects in the 90s, and I had been standard ground control for the final lethal field test inside the Cascade Mountains. 3 completely different men, 3 completely different states, separated by decades, yet all of us were haunted by the exact same mechanical air raid siren blaring through the static of a reality that was being manipulated from behind the curtain. Alan, David, and I are old men now. We spent the majority of our adult lives trapped in a cage of silence, driven by fear, shame, and the crushing weight of knowing that if we spoke out, the media and the authorities would simply paint us as crazy, disgruntled liars trying to extort the system. But we aren't running anymore. We don't care about their non-disclosure agreements, their corporate shell companies, or the cold-eyed men in dark suits who carry threats in their pockets. The reason I'm putting this entire narrative out there, the reason we decided to piece our individual nightmares into this one continuous warning, is because the experiments haven't stopped. Every single year, the National Forest logs document hundreds of mysterious disappearances near bodies of water and deep cave systems. People vanish without explanation, Their case is quietly archived under layers of bureaucratic red tape, while the local news channels comfortably report them as simple hiking accidents. But if you ever find yourself driving through a remote wilderness area late at night, and the local radio station suddenly drops into a deep vacuum tube analog hiss, pay attention. If you look at your dashboard clock and notice the digital numbers begin to roll backward while a thick, heavy, chemical-smelling fog rolls in from the trees, do not slow down. And if, underneath the quiet rustle of the pines, you hear the distant rising and falling wail of a mechanical air raid siren, you need to put your foot on the gas and pray to whatever universe you believe in that you can break the perimeter before the green light starts to pulse. Because out there in the dark, where the modern world ends and the old growth begins, the entities are still waiting, and the people who control them are always looking for new subjects to drag into the static. Stay safe out there, friends, and never stop speaking the truth, no matter how loud the silence tries to get.